I will say this, Mark is a ruthless business person, and I say that with respect, and whatever's in Facebook's interest is in his interest. Moving a bit in some political direction that's maybe not how you're built, I think is something that would be par for the course for him. I have been involved in politics ever since a young age. I've been a political donor since my early 20s. But I would never say I was a real participant, right? I was the kind of person who would host a fundraiser for the local congressman. So Mike Fitzpatrick, who was our congressman, rest his soul, wonderful, wonderful human being. His brother Brian now is the seat. We'd do the fundraiser at my house. And this goes back 20 years. A president was coming into town, I'd hosted a dinner with him. Ironically, one of the best things I ever did years and years ago, just to show you what a strange world this is, Chris Christie was going to run for president, I think it was in 2012. And I hosted him at Mark Zuckerberg's house in Palo Alto as an exploratory thing for running for president. How strange is that? Chris Christie, who I worked with to help legalize sports betting, Chris Christie sued the federal government saying, why do we not have sports betting in our Atlantic City casinos? We worked with him when I was on the board of FanDuel to support that case. Of all the places, he decides to do the fundraiser at Zuckerberg's house. And I asked, and I know Mark a bit, and I've known Chris Christie for years and his wife Mary Pat, and I've known Mark since before he started the company. He actually came to my offices when I was the CTO of Tribe because he was friends with Peter Thiel and Mark Pincus, my co-founder. And I got to babysit him for a week while he's still a student at Harvard. It's one of those crazy stories. And so I'm at his house and I ask him, I go, Mark, so explain to me, how are you doing a fundraiser at your house for Chris Christie? He said, do you remember when we donated all that money to the school thing? We donated $200 million to the state of New Jersey. See, I became very close with Mary Pat and Chris Christie, and I really like how practical he is. And while I'm again, I can't get the words right, I would describe Mark as apolitical at this point in time. This is almost 15 years ago. It's 2012, right? 13 years ago. I'd say he was moderately to the right, if anything, but was certainly apolitical in general at that point in time. And I remember all these lefties are in the house. John Doerr, who was an investor in my company, I'm like, John, you're about as lefty as it gets. He says, Mark invited me because he wants me to hear what Chris Christie has to say. I was like, well, that's actually pretty cool. That's when you started to realize a little bit about how politics works. Sometimes, if someone important enough invites you, you're going to come anyway. And I remember John Doerr saying that to me. He said, Mark invited me, and so I want to hear what Chris has to say. I was like, interesting. And so that goes way back. So 13 years ago, I hosted a fundraiser. Fast forward years later. So I'm one of those guys. The rubber chicken dinner, introduce the congressman, say hello. I've done that. But I became an actual participant once COVID happened because I actually was in there because it affected me. This wasn't some abstract policy thing. My kids were miserable in my house because they weren't in school. And so I became an actual advocate and activist in COVID policy. I remember it was right around my birthday. So it was August of 2020 when they said they're not sending the kids back to school for the start of fall 2020 school season. I was like, that's not good enough. You guys need to be held accountable. And so I have now for the past 5 years would describe myself as an activist, whereas I was absolutely not until COVID policy. And I think the left doesn't understand how many people there are like me who were passive political donors who became activists because they screwed up so badly in COVID. When Mark was still a student at Harvard, I spent a week with him at the Tribe offices as a favor to Peter Thiel and Mark Pincus, who's my co-founder of Tribe and was then the founder of Zynga. And at that point, Mark was a college student and I played babysitter. That's the only way to describe that week. As time went on, as Zynga became an important company, as Facebook became a more important company, I was in touch with Mark Zuckerberg. It wasn't like he was some buddy, but we'd occasionally do things. And as I mentioned, we ended up hosting the Chris Christie event 2012. So that was that was a decade later, right? I think I met Zuckerberg in 2004. I met him, Facebook was started in fall of 2004. I met him in the spring of 2004 before he had left college. So it was, 8 years later when we did the Chris Christie event in 2012. And I would say over that period of time, which is the period of time where I actually spent time with him, I would describe him as largely apolitical and, if anything, slightly right-leaning. A little bit of the Peter Thiel, somewhat libertarian camp. I think that at some point along the way, he did make a pretty significant transformation to become a pretty reliably left-leaning donor as well as campaigner, etc. And I think that probably has something to do with his wife, who I think was much more left-leaning than he was. But in my opinion, he's always natively built as a bit more libertarian and maybe wasn't comfortable with this. And so this latest incarnation of Mark Zuckerberg that is embracing of Trump, that is, oh, I did some things wrong with the fact checkers, in my opinion, that's more the guy I met all those years ago than that is yet another transformation. I think he reluctantly went a bit to the left for political reasons and for corporate reasons and for get-along reasons, but really at heart was a little bit more libertarian to begin with and is now maybe back to his roots. Pure conjecture. I think the last time I had a dinner or spent time with him was a decade ago. So, in fairness, that's my point of view, though, on his evolution, as people would say. I will say this, Mark is a ruthless business person, and I say that with respect. I say that not with disdain. And whatever's in Facebook's interest is in his interest. And so maybe moving a bit in some political direction that's maybe not how you're built, I think is something that would be par for the course for him, whereas other executives might not do that. Again, not even a criticism, just my personal assessment.